Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Winemaker's Widow. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. Vintage and Widow. The late September sun cast long shadows across the terrace slopes of Whodunit Vineyard, where the vines hung heavy with unpicked grapes that would never see the press. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her gardening gloves and looked thoughtfully at the neglected rows stretching above Much Benham village. The French dream of Jules Vallon had died with him 18 months ago, leaving behind a widow, a crumbling press house, and the limestone cellars that had once housed his ambitious hopes in sturdy oak casks. "Such a pity," murmured Lady Bantry, picking her way carefully along the overgrown path. Jules had such plans for this place. Remember how he used to speak of rivaling the great vineyards of Burgundy? Miss Marple nodded, her keen blue eyes taking in the sagging trellises and the press house with its slate roof already missing several tiles. Ambition is a curious thing, Dolly. Sometimes it outlives the dreamer. They had come at the invitation of Beatrice Vallon, Jules's widow, who maintained the dignified bearing of her English upbringing, despite the genteel poverty that had settled over the vineyard like morning mist. The farmhouse, built of local stone and timber, still retained its charm, though paint had peeled from the shutters and weeds pushed through the cobbled courtyard. Mrs. Vallon seems determined to salvage something from the enterprise, Lady Bantry observed as they approached the house, where voices could be heard through an open window. "The question," said Miss Marple quietly, "is what exactly she hopes to salvage, and at what cost." Inside the low-ceilinged parlor, they found Beatrice Vallon entertaining her guests with the sort of strained courtesy that spoke of reduced circumstances bravely borne. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, her graying hair still thick and well-arranged, her posture erect despite the weight of widowhood and debt that pressed upon her shoulders. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, how good of you to come," she said, rising with genuine warmth. "I'm afraid the hospitality is rather modest these days, but you're most welcome." The other occupants of the room presented a curious study in contrasts. Near the window stood Lionel Sykes, a sleek gentleman from London, whose well-tailored suit and polished shoes marked him as prosperous in the way that wine merchants often were when they dealt in other people's dreams. His manner was smooth, professional, with just a hint of impatience barely concealed beneath his urbane exterior. "Mr. Sykes has come all the way from London to assess our remaining stock," Beatrice explained with a slight flush. "There are still some casks in the cellar from Jules's better years." Sykes inclined his head with practiced courtesy. "Indeed, Mrs. Vallon, though I must stress the importance of a thorough evaluation. The wine trade is most particular about provenance and condition." Sprawled in a worn armchair with the casual confidence of local authority sat Maurice Clay, a man whose weathered features and capable hands marked him as someone equally at home with auction catalogs and livestock pens. His pale eyes held a calculating gleam as they moved between Sykes and Mrs. Vallon. "Of course, there's always the question of what's best for Beatrice in the long term," Clay said, his voice carrying the rough burr of rural Warwickshire. "Keeping a failing vineyard going, or perhaps considering other opportunities for the land. Developments coming to Much Benham, mark my words." Near the door, busily applying fresh labels to a collection of wine bottles, worked a young woman with quick, nervous movements. Gwen Archer had the sort of thin prettiness that spoke of too many worries and too little leisure, her engagement ring catching the light as she worked with practiced efficiency. "These bottles need proper presentation," she said without looking up, her voice carrying a defensive note. "Can't have Mr. Sykes thinking we don't take pride in our work." The final member of their small gathering sat quietly in the corner, methodically working on a wooden cask with the absorbed attention of a craftsman. Mr. Coates was past 70, his hands gnarled but steady as he tapped and tested the ancient wood. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, touching his cap with old-fashioned courtesy. "Afternoon, miss. Been trying to get these old beauties watertight again. Jules, God rest him, had a fine collection of cooperage. Shame to see it all going to waste." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair Beatrice indicated, her needlework bag at her side, and observed the dynamics of the little gathering with the sort of attention she might give to a particularly complex pattern of stitches. Sykes was speaking again, his tone becoming more insistent. "The cellar really must be properly organized before any meaningful assessment can take place, Mrs. Vallon. I understand there are several hogsheads that haven't been properly catalogued. The sooner we can establish exactly what remains—" "What Mr. Sykes means," interrupted Clay with a sardonic smile, "is that time's running short. The bank won't wait forever, and there are those who might offer a fair price for the land, if not the wine." Beatrice's composure flickered slightly. The vineyard was Jules's life work. "I cannot simply abandon it to property developers." "Sometimes," said Sykes smoothly, "the kindest thing is to accept reality. A clean purchase of the remaining stock might provide you with sufficient funds to make a fresh start elsewhere. Or, as Mr. Clay suggests, there might be other arrangements that would prove more practical." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she worked, but her attention never wavered from the conversation. There was something in the air of the room that reminded her unpleasantly of the stillness before a thunderstorm. "The cellar," said Beatrice finally. "Yes, I suppose it must be done. Jules always said the real treasure of Vallon lay in those limestone chambers he carved out himself." Gwen looked up from her bottles, a frown creasing her brow. "Those cellars give me the shivers. All that dampness and the smell of old wine souring, and those great casks balanced on their wedges, looking ready to roll at any moment." "Hogsheads are perfectly safe when properly maintained," said Coates firmly. Jules knew his cooperage. "Those wedges have held steady for years." "Nevertheless," said Sykes, consulting his pocket watch, "I think we should conduct our inspection while there's still good daylight. These old cellars can be treacherous in poor light." As the party prepared to move toward the cellar, Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in Beatrice's hands as she smoothed her skirts, and the way Maurice Clay's eyes lingered on a surveyor's map that lay partially folded on the sideboard. Small details, perhaps, but in Miss Marple's long experience, it was often the smallest details that proved most significant. The afternoon sun was already slanting low as they made their way across the courtyard toward the stone steps that led down into the heart of Jules Vallon's buried ambitions. Chapter 2, Cellar Cry. The Descent. Into the Vallon cellars was like stepping back through centuries. Stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet led down into the cool embrace of limestone walls that Jules Vallon had carved and shaped with his own hands. The air carried the complex perfume of aged wine, damp stone, and something else that Miss Marple could not quite identify. A sourness that spoke of dreams turned bitter. Sykes led the way with a battery lamp, its beam dancing across walls lined with empty bottle racks, and revealing the 3 massive hogsheads that dominated the central chamber. Each cask rested on wooden wedges, their curved bellies gleaming dully in the artificial light. "Magnificent specimens," Sykes murmured, running his hand along the nearest barrel. Jules certainly understood his cooperage. "These are genuine Limousin oak, if I'm not mistaken." Coates nodded with professional appreciation. "And seasoned properly. These barrels have seen better wine than most men taste in a lifetime." Miss Marple remained near the entrance with Beatrice, her sharp eyes adjusting to the dim light while the others moved deeper into the cellar. The limestone walls wept with condensation, and somewhere in the darkness water dripped with metronomic persistence. "The dampness is dreadful," Beatrice said with a slight shiver. Jules always claimed it was perfect for aging wine, but it seems to seep into one's very bones. "Old cellars have their own atmosphere," Miss Marple agreed, though her attention was caught by something else entirely. The floor beneath the hogsheads showed curious patterns in the dust, not the undisturbed accumulation one might expect, but rather evidence of recent disturbance. Sykes was examining the barrels with increasing interest, tapping them with a small mallet he had produced from his case. "The middle cask seems promising," he called back to Beatrice, "though I shall need to check the contents more thoroughly. Some of these may need to be moved for proper assessment." It was then that the accident happened. The sound came first, a groaning, creaking noise like old timber under strain, followed by Sykes's sharp cry of alarm. Then came the thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cellar as one of the great hogsheads broke, free from its restraints and rolled with gathering momentum. Across the stone floor, Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall as the massive barrel hurtled past, its iron hoop scraping against stone with a sound like fingernails on slate. It struck the far wall with devastating force before settling on its side, its contents, whatever they might have been, seeping across the cellar floor in dark rivulets. "Lionel." Beatrice's voice was sharp with horror. They found him pinned beneath the second hogshead, which had followed its companion in a devastating cascade. The wine merchant's usually immaculate appearance was grotesquely altered, his face ashen with shock and pain, his breathing labored and shallow. "Don't move him," Dr. Haydock's voice cut through the confusion as he arrived, summoned by Gwen's frantic telephone call. The doctor's examination was swift but thorough, his weathered face grave as he worked. Severe contusion of the chest, multiple fractures. "We need to get him to hospital immediately. Is it?" Beatrice began. "He'll live," Haydock said curtly, though it was a near thing. Another few inches and that barrel would have crushed his skull. As the ambulance crew carefully extracted Sykes from the wreckage, Inspector Slack arrived with his usual air of harried efficiency. He surveyed the scene with the expression of a man confronting an unwelcome but familiar problem. "Right then," he said, producing his notebook. "Nasty accident, this. How exactly did it happen?" The accounts varied in their details, but agreed on the essentials. Sykes had been examining the barrels when something had gone wrong with the supporting wedges. The first barrel had broken free, striking the second and creating the cascade that had nearly proved fatal. "I heard the rolling first," Gwen said, her voice still shaky from shock. "Like thunder underground. But there was something else, too. A sort of whistling sound, like a hook cutting through air just before the crash." Clay nodded grimly. "Heard it myself. These old cellars play tricks with sound. But there was definitely something before the impact." Coates, meanwhile, was examining the wreckage with a professional eye that seemed troubled. "Don't understand it," he muttered, poking at the displaced wedges with his stick. "I've been maintaining these barrels for nigh on 20 years. Never seen wedges fail like this. Not all at once." Miss Marple approached the scene with her characteristic quiet attention to detail. The wedges lay scattered across the floor, some still in place, others knocked askew by the rolling barrels, but it was not the wedges themselves that caught her interest. It was their position and condition. "Most unfortunate," Slack was saying to Beatrice, "though I suppose these things happen with old equipment. Still, might be wise to have the remaining barrel secured properly before anyone else ventures down here." "The insurance people will want a full report," Clay added, his tone carefully neutral. "Might speed things along, actually. Sometimes a tragedy like this helps clarify one's priorities." Beatrice's composure was admirable under the circumstances, though Miss Marple noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts. Poor Mr. Sykes. To think he came all this way only to meet with such an accident. Accident? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, crouching beside one of the displaced wedges. Though one does wonder about the timing. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with mild irritation. What's that supposed to mean, Miss Marple? Accidents happen when they happen. No sense looking for complications where none exist. Oh, I quite agree, Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. It's simply that I find myself curious about small details. This wedge, for instance. She indicated the piece of wood in question, noting how Coates immediately bent to examine it more closely. The old cooper's expression grew increasingly puzzled as he turned the wedge over in his hands. That's peculiar, he said slowly. This here wedge has been set the wrong way round. See this groove from the adze? It should face inward for proper stability, but it's been placed facing out. And there's fresh grease on it, too. Tallow by the look of it. Could that have caused the failure? Dr. Haydock asked, returning from seeing Sykes safely loaded into the ambulance. Coates shook his head uncertainly. Might have made it easier for the wedge to slip, I suppose. But why anyone would set it that way? He trailed off, clearly troubled by implications he couldn't quite grasp. Miss Marple knelt beside the wedge's original position, her keen eyes noting details that others might miss. Where the wood had rested against the stone, there were traces of purple crystalline deposits, whinstone or tartaric acid, as the French called it. But the floor around the impression was surprisingly clean, as if it had been recently swept or disturbed. Most interesting, she murmured, almost to herself. One would expect more dust and debris after months of undisturbed storage. Gwen had grown very quiet during this examination. Her earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching apprehension. When Slack asked her about her whereabouts during the accident, she answered with unusual precision, as if she had already rehearsed her responses. I was in the press house working on the bottle labels, she said firmly. I heard the commotion and came running. Terrible thing to happen, especially with poor Mr. Sykes being so thorough in his work. As the various officials completed their business and began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered in the cellar, her needlework forgotten as she continued her quiet examination of the scene. There was something here that didn't quite fit the pattern of a simple accident, though she couldn't yet put her finger on exactly what troubled her. The limestone walls seemed to whisper secrets in the dim light, and Miss Marple had learned long ago to listen when old stones had stories to tell. Chapter: The Wedge Wrong Way. The morning following. The accident dawned gray and drizzling, the sort of weather that seemed to seep melancholy into the very stones of Much Benham. Miss Marple made her way back to Whodunit Vineyard with the quiet persistence of someone who had unfinished business, her umbrella protecting both herself and her ever-present knitting bag from the persistent moisture. She found the cellar door standing open, with Inspector Slack's voice echoing up from below in tones of professional irritation. Descending the familiar steps, she discovered him in heated discussion with Maurice Clay, while Coates worked methodically at securing the remaining hogshead with additional wedges and rope. I've told you already, Slack was saying, his notebook damp from the cellar's humidity. The matter's been thoroughly investigated. Accidental failure of supporting equipment. Nothing more. These old places are death traps waiting to happen. Clay stood with his arms folded, his expression skeptical. All the same, Inspector, one does wonder about the timing. Poor Sykes arrives to assess the stock, and within hours he's laid up in hospital. Convenient, you might say, for certain parties. Meaning what exactly? Meaning nothing actionable, I'm sure. Simply observing that accidents sometimes benefit those who might otherwise find themselves inconvenienced by thorough examination. Miss Marple approached the spot where the fatal wedge had been displaced. noting that someone had made an attempt to restore order to the scene. The broken barrel had been hauled upright, its contents, what remained of them, pulled in dark stains across the limestone floor. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not intruding, but I found myself quite curious about yesterday's unfortunate events." Slack looked up from his notes with barely concealed exasperation. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, this is a straightforward case of mechanical failure. No need to complicate matters with amateur theorizing." "Oh, I quite understand," she replied, settling herself on a convenient stone ledge, "though I confess I remain puzzled by certain small details." She produced the troublesome wedge from her knitting bag, having retrieved it during her earlier examination. In the morning light filtering down from above, its peculiarities were even more apparent. "This carpenter's mark, for instance," she said, indicating the adze groove that Coates had noticed. Mr. Coates mentioned it was oriented incorrectly. The old cooper looked up from his work, his lined face thoughtful. "That's troubled me all night. I've been setting these wedges for nigh on 40 years, and I've never seen one placed backwards like that. Goes against everything Jules taught me about proper support. Could it have been an honest mistake?" "Not likely," Coates said firmly. "Jules was particular about his cooperage. Every wedge marked and placed just so. That one's been deliberately turned. I'll stake my reputation on it." Miss Marple turned the wedge over in her hands, her fingers exploring its surface with the delicate attention of someone accustomed to detecting the subtlest variations in texture and substance. "And this substance along the edge," she continued. "What did you call it, Mr. Coates?" "Tallow. Fresh tallow, at that. Someone's greased this wedge recently, within a day or two, I'd guess. Makes it slip easier, you see. Removes the friction that keeps it locked in place." Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly impatient. "All very interesting, but old wood shifts and settles. Perhaps the wedge worked loose naturally over time." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I confess I find the location equally curious." She moved to the stone foundation where the wedge had rested, kneeling with some difficulty to examine the impression it had left. "You see these purple crystals embedded in the stone, wine stone, I believe, or tartrate deposits from years of barrel storage. But observe how they're distributed." The men gathered around her, even Slack showing reluctant interest despite his professional skepticism. "The crystals are heaviest at the center of the impression," she continued, "where the wedge would have pressed most firmly over many months. But around the edges, where one would expect dust and debris to accumulate, the stone is quite clean, almost as if it had been recently disturbed." Coates nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his weathered features. "You're saying this wedge wasn't in place very long?" "I'm suggesting the possibility," Miss Marple said carefully. "The evidence seems to indicate recent placement rather than months of undisturbed positioning." Clay's eyes had sharpened with interest. "Are you implying this was deliberate sabotage?" "I'm implying nothing beyond what the physical evidence suggests," she said, "though I do find myself wondering about the sequence of events." She rose carefully, brushing dust from her skirts, and approached the remaining hogshead where Coates continued his reinforcement work. The barrels were stored in a specific arrangement, were they not? This one here, the fallen one there, and the third against the far wall. That's right. Jules always kept them in the same positions. Said it helped him keep track of the vintages, and the wedges would have been similarly positioned for maximum stability. Of course they would, each barrel balanced just so, with wedges front and back to prevent rolling. Miss Marple studied the remaining evidence with the absorbed attention of someone working out a particularly complex pattern. The positioning, the timing, the convenient presence of certain individuals at the moment of crisis. All these elements suggested a design more deliberate than mere chance. "Inspector Slack," she said finally, Might I suggest that someone with expertise in such matters examine the remaining wedges? Not to challenge your conclusions, naturally, but simply to establish whether this particular arrangement was indeed typical. Slack's mustache bristled with annoyance, but even he could see the logic in the request. Very well, though I maintain this is unnecessary complication of a straightforward matter. As if summoned by their conversation, Gwen Archer appeared at the cellar entrance, her face pale with anxiety. "Oh," she said, seeing the assembled group. "I didn't realize that is, Mrs. Vaughan sent me to check if anything needed tidying up after yesterday's disturbance." Miss Marple noticed how the young woman's eyes went immediately to the wedge in her hands, and how her fingers twisted nervously at her engagement ring. "How thoughtful of Mrs. Vaughan," she said gently, "though I fear the damage extends beyond what simple tidying might remedy." "Yes. Terrible thing. Poor Mr. Sykes, and him being so thorough in his examination of everything." Gwen's voice carried an odd note, as if she were reciting a prepared statement rather than expressing spontaneous sympathy. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "One does wonder what might have been discovered if the examination had been completed." The silence that followed this observation was pregnant with unspoken implications. Clay shifted uncomfortably. Coates continued his methodical work with increased concentration, and Gwen's pallor deepened noticeably. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I should report back to Mrs. Vaughan that everything's being properly handled." After she'd gone, Miss Marple remained contemplating the wedge in her hands, turning it over and over as if it might reveal secrets beyond what was immediately visible. "Small things," she murmured to herself. "It's always the small things that tell the true story." Chapter 4. Purple Dust, Clean Floor. The afternoon brought Dr. Haydock to the vineyard, summoned not by medical emergency, but by Miss Marple's quiet request for his professional opinion on matters that extended beyond mere accident. She met him in the courtyard, where autumn leaves gathered in drifts against the stone walls, and the air carried the melancholy scent of overripe grapes. "Curious business, this barrel affair," Haydock said without preamble, his medical bag in one hand and a magnifying glass borrowed from his surgery in the other. "Sykes will recover, though he'll carry the marks of it for some time. Nasty bruising across the ribs, and he keeps muttering about hearing something just before the impact. Something claims there was a sound like metal scraping stone, followed by what he described as a singing noise. Shock can play tricks with memory, of course, but he's quite insistent about the sequence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Most interesting. And does his account match what the others heard?" "Near enough. That Archer girl mentioned a whistling sound, and Clay heard something he couldn't quite identify. All agreed it came just before the crash." They made their way down into the cellar, where the afternoon light slanted weakly through the narrow windows set high in the limestone walls. The scene of devastation had been partially cleared, but the essential evidence remained undisturbed, at Miss Marple's gentle but firm insistence. "Now then," she said, settling herself with her knitting near the spot where the fatal hogshead originally rested, "I find myself particularly interested in the condition of the floor." Haydock crouched beside her, his physician's attention to detail serving him well in this unusual examination. The stone surface bore the accumulated patina of decades, stained with wine and marked by the passage of countless feet and the rolling of heavy barrels. "What exactly am I looking for?" "Patterns, my dear doctor, or perhaps more accurately, the absence of expected patterns." She indicated a roughly circular area where the barrel had originally stood. One would expect after months of storage to find a certain accumulation of dust and debris around the base of such a heavy object. Wine barrels weep, you know, and the evaporation leaves residues. Haydock adjusted his spectacles and peered more closely at the flagstones. "I see what you mean. There should be a distinct ring of sediment, but this area appears to have been cleaned precisely. And yet observe the purple crystalline deposits that remain embedded in the deeper crevices of the stone. These tartrate formations take considerable time to develop and are not easily removed. The doctor scraped at one of the purple crystals with his penknife, noting its hardness and the way it had bonded with the limestone. Years of accumulation, I should think. But you're right about the surrounding area being suspiciously tidy. Miss Marple moved her attention to the floor where the barrels had rolled during their destructive passage. Here, too, the evidence told an intriguing story for those with eyes to see it. "Notice this long scrape mark," she said, pointing to a thin line scratched into the stone surface. "Rather deep for something caused by the barrel's iron hoops, wouldn't you say? The metal would roll smoothly, not drag in this particular manner." Haydock traced the mark with his finger, feeling its depth and sharpness. More like something being pulled across the stone under considerable tension. A rope, perhaps. Or a chain. Or, said Miss Marple quietly, something designed to hook and pull. She produced from her bag a small garden tool that she had borrowed from Beatrice's potting shed, a grape hook used for reaching high branches and manipulating heavy objects. The curved metal end bore fresh scratches, and when she held it near the scrape mark, the correspondence was unmistakable. "You think someone used this to trigger the accident?" "I think someone may have found it useful for applying leverage at precisely the right moment. Though, of course, one would need to examine the tool more carefully to be certain." As if to emphasize her point, she turned the grape hook over in her hands, revealing along its curved edge a series of small nicks and abrasions that spoke of recent and forceful use against hard surfaces. They were interrupted by the arrival of Coates, who appeared at the cellar entrance with his familiar shambling gait and an expression of deep concern. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I've been thinking about what you said regarding them wedges." He descended the steps carefully, his weathered hands trailing along the stone wall for support. "And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Coates?" "Well, it's like this. See, I've been tending these barrels for the better part of 20 years, and I know every wedge, every position, every little peculiarity of the arrangement. That barrel that fell, it was sitting different yesterday morning. Different how?" Coates moved to the empty space where the hogshead had rested, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone reconstructing a familiar scene from memory. "The back wedge was set properly when I checked 2 days ago. Front wedge too, both carved by Jules himself and positioned just as he taught me. But yesterday, when that London fellow arrived, something struck me as not quite right." "But you didn't investigate immediately?" "No, and more's the pity. Thought perhaps I was imagining things, or that the damp had caused some settling. These old cellars play tricks with your eyes. What with the shadows and such." Miss Marple encouraged him to continue with gentle prompting, sensing that the old cooper's observations might prove crucial to understanding the sequence of events. "When I examined the wreckage after the accident," Coates went on, "I found something that bothered me considerably. That wedge you showed us this morning, it weren't just placed the wrong way round. It were also sitting higher than it should have been, like something had been placed underneath to change the angle." "Something such as what?" "Hard to say for certain, but there were traces of sawdust and wood shavings mixed with the whinstone. Fresh shavings, mind you, not the old settled dust you'd expect to find." Haydock looked up from his examination of the floor, suggesting someone had been doing carpentry work recently. "Or more likely," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "someone had inserted wooden shims or packers to alter the stability of the barrel support. A wedge sitting at the wrong angle and elevated beyond its proper position would create a most precarious balance." She moved to examine the area more closely, her sharp eyes picking out details that others might miss. Among the debris scattered by the barrel's fall, she found several small slivers of wood that bore the clean cuts of recent sawing. Most illuminating, she murmured, collecting the evidence in her handkerchief. Someone took considerable care to ensure that the right pressure applied at the right moment would produce exactly the result we witnessed. As the three of them continued their investigation, the shadows lengthened and the cellar grew darker. But with each new detail uncovered, the picture of deliberate sabotage became increasingly clear. "The question now," said Miss Marple, folding her hands over her knitting, "is not whether this was an accident, but rather who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to arrange such an elaborate deception." Above them, footsteps echoed in the courtyard and voices drifted down through the cellar's entrance. Soon, Miss Marple reflected, it would be time to confront the more difficult questions of motive and identity. Chapter 5. Label Written. Over. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Beatrice Vallon, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain around the edges. She stood in the doorway clutching a manila envelope, her knuckles white with tension. "Miss Marple, I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I find myself in need of guidance regarding yesterday's events." Miss Marple welcomed her guest with characteristic warmth, settling her in the chintz-covered armchair beside the morning fire and preparing tea with the sort of unhurried attention that encouraged confidences. "I've been thinking," Beatrice began, accepting a cup with hands that trembled slightly, "about what you observed in the cellar. Those questions you raised about the wedges and the floor markings. I fear there may be complications I hadn't considered." "What sort of complications, my dear?" Beatrice opened the envelope with reluctance, revealing a collection of papers that appeared to be official correspondence. Insurance matters primarily. The company has sent an assessor, and there are questions being raised about the authenticity of our remaining stock. Miss Marple set down her own teacup with careful precision. "Authenticity? It seems that poor Mr. Sykes, before his accident, had begun to express certain doubts about the condition and provenance of the wine we claim to possess. The insurance people are now suggesting that his injuries may have prevented him from completing what might have been a rather uncomfortable evaluation. The implications hung in the air between them like morning mist, insubstantial but chilling." Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone accustomed to allowing others to reveal their secrets at their own pace. "You see," Beatrice continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, "Jules's final years were not as successful as we had led people to believe. The harvest failed, the market turned against small producers, and we found ourselves with cellars full of barrels that held more hope than actual wine. And yet, you maintain the appearance of ongoing production." Beatrice's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow unchecked down her cheeks. "What choice did we have? The bank, the creditors, the insurance premiums, all based on the assumption that we possess stock worth substantial sums. When Jules died, I discovered that several of the barrels contained little more than dreams and disappointment." Miss Marple reached across to pat her guest's hand with gentle sympathy. "And so you took steps to supplement the inventory?" Gwen suggested it initially. She has connections with other small producers, sources of wine that could be relabeled and represented as Vallon. Nothing dishonest, you understand. Genuine wine, simply from different vineyards. But wine that would not command the prices expected of Jules Vallon's celebrated vintages. "Precisely. And now, with the insurance investigation and the question surrounding poor Mr. Sykes's accident, I fear the entire deception may be uncovered." Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, where she had placed the various pieces of evidence collected during her investigation. Among them was a sample of the chalk writing from one of the barrels, carefully preserved on a scrap of paper. "Tell me," she said, returning to her chair, "about the barrel markings." I noticed that several had been relabeled with new information written over the original inscriptions. Beatrice nodded miserably. Gwen's work mostly. She has a talent for making things appear more presentable than they might otherwise seem. And the barrel that fell yesterday, had it been similarly treated? Yes, though perhaps not entirely successfully. The original marking showed through the chalk, and Mr. Sykes had begun to ask awkward questions about why a cask labeled empty would sound so full when tapped. Miss Marple considered this information, with the sort of focused attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The threads were beginning to come together, though the final design remained obscure. Mrs. Vaughan, I wonder if you might accompany me back to the vineyard. There are certain aspects of the cellar arrangements that I should like to examine more closely. They found the vineyard in a state of subdued activity, with Gwen working industriously in the press house, while Maurice Clay conducted what appeared to be a surveyor's assessment of the property boundaries. The atmosphere was charged with the sort of tension that precedes thunderstorms. In the cellar, Miss Marple approached the remaining hogsheads with renewed interest, her attention focused on the various chalk markings that decorated their curved surfaces. The barrel in question bore clear evidence of having been relabeled multiple times, with layers of chalk writing creating a palimpsest of changing stories. Most revealing, she murmured, examining the topmost inscription. The word empty appears to have been applied quite recently, over what looks like an original date marking. She tapped the barrel gently with her knuckles, producing a hollow sound that spoke of considerable liquid content rather than the emptiness claimed by the label. But surely, Beatrice said, if the barrel were truly full, it would be far too heavy to have rolled so easily during the accident. An excellent observation, Miss Marple agreed, which raises the interesting question of exactly what the barrel contains, and whether that content matches what one might expect from a vintage wine. She moved closer to the barrel's bung, where a small amount of condensation had formed, touched her finger to the moisture, and tasted it with the delicate precision of someone long experienced in household chemistry. She paused thoughtfully. Most curious. This tastes distinctly of water, rather than wine. Fresh water, in fact, with perhaps a trace of minerals that might come from a well or spring. The implications of this discovery were not lost on either woman. Someone, Miss Marple said quietly, took considerable trouble to ensure that this particular barrel would both sound convincingly full when tapped and possess the weight necessary to cause serious injury when released. But who would do such a thing, and why? Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Gwen, her face flushed from hurrying and her manner agitated. Mrs. Vaughan, thank goodness I found you. There's been another development. The insurance assessor wants to examine all the remaining barrels immediately. He's particularly interested in the one with the fresh chalk marking. Miss Marple observed the young woman's nervous energy with keen interest, noting particularly the way her eyes avoided direct contact and the defensive set of her shoulders. Miss Archer, she said gently, I wonder if you might explain to us the process by which the barrel labels are updated. It seems there may have been some confusion about the contents of the various casks. Gwen's flush deepened, and her hands twisted nervously at her apron strings. I only did what Mrs. Vaughan asked. The old markings were faded and unclear, so I made them more presentable for Mr. Sykes's inspection. And the decision to mark the barrel as empty. It seemed appropriate at the time, given the circumstances. Miss Marple filed this cryptic response away for future consideration, sensing that there were layers of meaning beneath the young woman's carefully chosen words. Chapter 6, Crapen Green Twine. The afternoon light filtering through the cellar's narrow windows had begun to take on the golden quality peculiar to autumn when Miss Marple made her discovery of the green twine. She had been examining the stone walls with methodical thoroughness, running her hands along the rough-hewn surfaces where generations of limestone dust had settled into every crevice and crack. "Most peculiar," she murmured to herself, her fingers tracing what appeared to be a thin line of disturbance in the accumulated grime. The mark ran horizontally across the wall at roughly shoulder height, disappearing into a narrow fissure between two blocks of stone. Dr. Haydock, who had remained to assist with her investigation, looked up from his examination of the barrel debris with professional curiosity. "Found something significant?" "Possibly. There appears to be evidence that something was drawn through this crack in recent days, something that disturbed years of settled dust." She produced her reading glasses and peered more closely at the fissure, noting how the limestone had been worn smooth by decades of moisture and time. Within the narrow opening, caught on a small projection of rock, hung a few strands of green fiber. "Garden twine, I believe," she said, carefully extracting the material with her knitting needle, the sort used for training vines or supporting heavy plants. The significance of this discovery became apparent when they ascended to examine the press house, where Gwen maintained her supplies for the endless task of maintaining the vineyard's appearance of productivity on a wooden shelf. Beside her labeling material sat several rolls of twine in various colors and thicknesses. Miss Marple compared the fibers she had found with the available stock, noting immediately that one roll of green twine appeared to have been recently used. Several yards had been cut from it with sharp scissors, leaving clean ends that contrasted with the weathered appearance of the remaining coil. "Miss Archer," she called gently to Gwen, who was working with determined concentration at a table covered with bottles and labels. "Might I ask about your garden twine? I notice one roll appears to have been used recently." Gwen's hand stilled over her work, and she turned with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "The twine?" "Oh, yes. I used some yesterday morning to secure some loose vine branches. The autumn winds have been quite fierce, and Mrs. Vallon is particular about maintaining appearances." "Yesterday morning?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Before or after Mr. Sykes's arrival?" "Before, certainly. I wouldn't have had time for garden work once the inspection began." Miss Marple nodded with apparent acceptance, though her keen eyes noted the way Gwen's fingers trembled as she resumed her labeling work. The young woman's nervousness had increased markedly since the discovery of the twine, and her explanations carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had prepared her responses in advance. "I wonder," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "if you might have noticed whether anyone else had occasion to use your supplies. These communal arrangements can sometimes lead to confusion about who has borrowed what. No one else comes into the press house without permission," Gwen replied, with perhaps more force than the question warranted. "Mrs. Vallon is most particular about maintaining proper inventory of our materials." Dr. Haydock had been examining the remaining tools and equipment with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to forensic observation. Among the various implements hanging from wooden pegs, he noted what appeared to be recent disturbance in the dust patterns. "This grape hook seems to have been moved recently," he observed, lifting the curved metal tool from its position. "The wall behind it is considerably cleaner than the surrounding areas." The grape hook itself bore unmistakable signs of recent use. Fresh scratches marred its surface, and small fragments of what looked like limestone dust clung to its curved end. When Miss Marple held it up to the light, she could see that the metal had been polished bright in several places, as if it had been rubbed against hard surfaces under considerable pressure. "Most interesting," she murmured, examining the tool's construction. The hook portion was designed for grasping and pulling, while the handle provided leverage for manipulating heavy objects at a distance. It would, she reflected, be admirably suited for applying precise force to a carefully prepared wedge. "Miss Archer," she said, turning back to Gwen with the patient persistence of someone accustomed to extracting uncomfortable truths, I noticed this grape hook bears signs of having been used for something more strenuous than ordinary garden work. The metal is scratched, and the point shows evidence of contact with stone. Can you enlighten us about its recent employment? Gwen's composure finally began to crack under the gentle but relentless questioning. Her face had grown pale, and her hands shook visibly as she sat down the bottle she'd been labeling. Mr. Clay borrowed it several days ago. He said he needed it for moving some heavy stones in the upper vineyard. I haven't had occasion to use it myself recently. Mr. Clay? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with delicate surprise. How thoughtful of him to assist with the maintenance work. And did he return it personally, or did you find it back in its usual place? He brought it back yesterday morning just before Mr. Sykes arrived, actually. Said he'd finished with it and wanted to make sure everything was properly organized for the inspection. The timing of this revelation struck both Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock as remarkably convenient. Clay's presence at the vineyard immediately before the fatal accident, combined with his access to the tools that might have facilitated sabotage, added another layer to the increasingly complex web of circumstance and opportunity. And the twine, Miss Marple prompted gently. Did Mr. Clay have occasion to borrow that as well? Gwen's resistance finally collapsed entirely, and she sank into her chair with the defeated air of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had finally been breached. He said he needed it to secure something in the cellar, she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. Something about making sure the barrels were properly stabilized for the inspection. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, and I thought it was all perfectly legitimate. The implications of this confession hung heavy in the air of the press house. Clay's involvement in both the preparation of tools and his presence during the critical period before Sykes's arrival painted a picture of deliberate planning that went far beyond mere coincidence. Miss Marple moved to the window and gazed out at the vineyard, where Clay could be seen in the distance, still engaged in his mysterious surveying activities. His movements were purposeful and confident, those of a man comfortable with his environment and secure in his plans. Dr. Haydock, she said quietly, I believe it might be prudent to examine the cellar once more, with particular attention to any evidence of how this twine might have been employed. If my suspicions are correct, we may find that yesterday's accident was the culmination of a considerably more elaborate scheme than we initially supposed. As they prepared to return to the cellar, Miss Marple reflected on the growing body of evidence that pointed toward deliberate sabotage. The misplaced wedge, the fresh tool marks, the disturbed dust patterns, and now the revelation of Clay's access to the implements of destruction. All these elements suggested a crime planned with meticulous attention to detail. The question that remained was not whether the attack on Sykes had been intentional, but rather what combination of motives had driven someone to attempt murder in such an elaborate and calculated manner. The answer, she suspected, lay not only in the physical evidence they had uncovered, but in the complex web of relationships and interests that surrounded the failing vineyard and its desperate inhabitants. In the distance, Clay had paused in his work and was looking in their direction, his hands shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. Even at that distance, Miss Marple could sense his watchful attention, and she wondered how much he suspected about the progress of their investigation. Chapter 7. Angel's Share. That grew. The evening shadows were lengthening across the vineyard when Miss Marple made her request to examine the upper reaches of the cellar, where the limestone ceiling arched into darkness, and the accumulated moisture of centuries had created its own mysterious geography of stalactites and mineral deposits. I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of barrel storage, she explained to Coates, who had volunteered to guide her exploration with the sure-footed confidence of long familiarity. particularly regarding what I believe vintners call the angel's share, the natural evaporation that occurs during aging. The old cooper nodded with professional understanding. That's the portion that disappears over time. Wine breathes, you see, through the wood of the cask, loses maybe 2% a year to the air, sometimes more in dry conditions. They climbed the narrow stone steps that led to the upper level of the cellar, where additional storage space had been carved from the living rock. Here, the atmosphere was even more redolent with the complex perfumes of aged wine, and the darkness seemed to press against the feeble illumination of their battery lamps. So a barrel stored for several years should be noticeably lighter than when first filled? Should be. Yes. Jules was always particular about checking the levels, marking down the losses in his record books. Proud of his angel's share, he said it meant his wine was breathing properly. Miss Marple paused beside a wooden framework that had been constructed to support additional casks in the narrow space. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, creating a rhythmic percussion that echoed through the stone chambers. How curious, she observed, noting that the dripping water had created small puddles on the floor, despite the natural drainage of the sloped stone surface. This moisture appears to be quite fresh, not the accumulated seepage one might expect in such an ancient cellar. Coates followed her gaze upward, where the beam of his lamp revealed a complex arrangement of wooden beams and stone supports. Among these architectural elements, something glinted wetly in the artificial light. "Well, I'll be blessed," he muttered, moving closer for a better view. "Someone's rigged up a water line along them beams. See there? That metal pipe running along the joint." "Indeed," Miss Marple said approvingly, "though I confess myself uncertain about its purpose. Surely the cellar requires no additional moisture? Not for wine storage, it don't. Too much water ruins the aging process, dilutes the alcohol content, and spoils the flavor. Jules would never have approved of such a contraption." They followed the pipe's path as far as their lights would permit, discovering that it led eventually to a small chamber where additional equipment had been hidden behind stacked cases of empty bottles. Here they found a hand pump and several lengths of rubber tubing, along with what appeared to be a measuring device of some sort. "A most elaborate arrangement," Miss Marple observed, examining the apparatus with the careful attention of someone accustomed to unraveling complex domestic mysteries. "Though I suspect its purpose was not to add moisture to the cellar environment, but rather to add weight to specific barrels." The implications of this discovery became clearer when they returned to the main cellar and examined the fallen hogshead more closely. The wood around the bung showed signs of having been disturbed, with fresh tool marks where someone had removed and replaced the cork stopper. "You see," Miss Marple explained to Coates, who was studying the evidence with growing comprehension, "if someone wished to make a barrel appear to contain aged wine while actually filling it with water, they would need some method of introducing the liquid without disturbing the external appearance. And water being heavier than aged wine, what with the alcohol having evaporated over time, the barrel would roll with considerably more force when released." "Precisely." The angel's share, which should have made the barrel lighter, was instead replaced with something that made it substantially heavier. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Maurice Clay, who appeared at the cellar entrance with the casual confidence of someone entirely at ease with his surroundings. His weathered features bore no trace of concern, and his manner suggested nothing more than neighborly curiosity about their activities. "Afternoon, Miss Marple Coates. Trust you're finding everything in order down here. Terrible business about poor Sykes, but I suppose these old cellars can be treacherous for those unfamiliar with their peculiarities." Miss Marple regarded him with the mild interest of someone making polite conversation, though her sharp eyes noted the way his gaze moved immediately to the evidence they had been examining. "Indeed. Mr. Clay, we've been discussing the fascinating process of wine aging, particularly the natural evaporation that occurs over time. Mr. Coates has been most instructive about the technical aspects. "Ah, the angel's share," Clay said with apparent expertise. "Expensive business, that every gallon lost to evaporation represents money disappearing into thin air. Makes one appreciate why some producers might be tempted to compensate for such losses." Compensate? Well, there are ways of maintaining liquid levels if one is so inclined. Not strictly traditional, you understand, but practical considerations sometimes override pure theory. Coates bristled at the suggestion. Jules would never have tampered with his wines in such a manner. He valued authenticity above all else, even when it cost him profits. Jules was an idealist, Clay replied with a slight smile. Admirable, certainly, but not always practical in the modern market. Sometimes circumstances require more flexible approaches. Miss Marple listened to this exchange with growing fascination, noting particularly Clay's easy familiarity with techniques for adulterating wine stocks. His knowledge seemed remarkably comprehensive for someone whose primary business involved property assessment rather than viticulture. "You seem quite knowledgeable about such matters. Mr. Clay, have you had occasion to study wine production professionally? One picks up things over the years, particularly in a district where several small producers struggle with similar challenges. The temptation to cut corners can be considerable when one faces financial pressures. And you would know about such pressures from your assessment work. I imagine property values, mortgage situations, that sort of thing." Clay's expression remained affable, though Miss Marple detected a slight hardening around his eyes. "Part of the business, certainly. One develops an understanding of when properties might become available for development or when owners might be receptive to advantageous offers." The conversation was taking on undertones that made Coates visibly uncomfortable. The old cooper shifted nervously from foot to foot, his weathered hands working anxiously at the brim of his cap. "Seems to me," he said finally, "that there's been altogether too much speculation about poor Jules's wine and Beatrice's affairs. Woman's had troubles enough without folk questioning her husband's methods." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said gently, "though I confess myself curious about the practical aspects of cellar management. This water system, for instance, it seems remarkably sophisticated for such a small operation." Clay's attention sharpened noticeably. Water system? The piping arrangement in the upper cellar, most ingeniously concealed and clearly of recent installation. "I wondered if you might know its purpose, given your familiarity with the property." For the first time since his arrival, Clay's composure showed signs of strain. His easy confidence faltered slightly, and he moved closer to examine the evidence they had uncovered. "Can't say I'm familiar with any recent modifications," he said carefully. "Though I suppose Beatrice might have made improvements without consulting the neighbors." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though the installation appears to require considerable technical knowledge, not the sort of thing one might undertake without professional assistance." The silence that followed this observation was pregnant with unspoken implications. Clay's expression had grown thoughtful, and his eyes moved restlessly between the evidence of tampering and the faces of his companions. "Well," he said finally, "I should leave you to your investigations. No doubt everything will become clear in due course." As he departed, Miss Marple and Coates exchanged meaningful glances. The old cooper shook his head with evident concern. "That one knows more than he's letting on, mark my words. And his interest in Beatrice's affairs has always struck me as uncommonly keen." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her attention returning to the elaborate water system that had transformed the angel's share from a loss into a weapon. Chapter 8. Candle Bung. Condensation. The discovery of the water system had cast a new light on the events in the cellar. But Miss Marple found herself drawn back to examine the remaining evidence with fresh eyes. Armed with a candle borrowed from Beatrice's kitchen and her ever-present magnifying glass, she descended once more into the limestone chambers where truth lay hidden among the shadows. The temperature differential should be quite revealing, she explained to Dr. Haydock, who had arrived in response to her telephone call, requesting his professional opinion on certain physical phenomena. Wine stored at cellar temperature behaves quite differently from water recently introduced into a container. She lit the candle and held it near the bung of the intact hogshead, watching with scientific interest as the flame's heat created a visible ring of condensation on the wooden surface around the cork stopper. "Most illuminating," she murmured, noting how quickly the moisture formed. Genuine aged wine would be at ambient temperature after months of storage. But water introduced recently would still retain the cooler temperature of its source. Dr. Haydock nodded with professional appreciation for her methodology. The condensation pattern indicates the contents are significantly cooler than the surrounding air. Hardly what one would expect from wine that had been aging in these conditions for any length of time. They moved methodically from barrel to barrel, testing each one with the simple but effective candle technique. The results painted a clear picture of systematic deception. Several of the casks showed the telltale condensation, rings that betrayed their recent filling with cold water. Someone has been remarkably thorough in their preparations, Miss Marple observed, making careful notes in her small leather notebook. This was not a hastily conceived scheme, but rather a methodical campaign extending over some considerable period. In a cupboard tucked into an alcove of the cellar wall, she discovered additional evidence of the deception's scope. Among the various tools and supplies stored there, she found a piece of chalk and a small pair of scissors clearly designed for cutting twine. More significantly, she uncovered a wooden box containing numerous cork bungs in various stages of use, some freshly cut, others bearing the stains and wear of genuine service. "The attention to detail is quite remarkable," she said, holding up one of the newer bungs to the candlelight. "Someone took considerable care to ensure that even the cork stoppers would support the illusion of aged wine storage." Dr. Haydock examined the contents of the box with growing amazement. "There must be dozens of bungs here, in different conditions to match wines of various ages. This represents months of preparation indeed. And observe these chalk markings on several of the corks, dates and notations that correspond to the labeling system used throughout the cellar. Someone maintained meticulous records of their deception." As they continued their investigation, Miss Marple's attention was caught by something that had been nagging at her consciousness since her first examination of the scene. On the floor near where the fatal barrel had originally stood, she noticed small fragments of material that had escaped her earlier notice. Kneeling carefully on the damp stone, she collected several scraps of what appeared to be paper or cardboard, each bearing traces of purple staining that matched the wine deposits found elsewhere in the cellar. "Labels," she said with quiet satisfaction, piecing together the fragments with the patience of someone accustomed to reconstructing broken china. "Original labels that have been removed and replaced, probably multiple times. The reconstructed pieces revealed portions of dates and vineyard notations. That told a story quite different from the current barrel markings, where the present labels indicated specific Vallon vintages. The original fragments suggested wine from various other sources, smaller vineyards, cooperative producers, and commercial suppliers." "The scope of the substitution is breathtaking," Dr. Haydock observed. "This goes far beyond simple mislabeling. Someone has essentially created an entirely fictitious inventory and maintained it with remarkable attention to detail." Miss Marple agreed. "The question is whether this elaborate deception was intended primarily to defraud insurance companies and creditors, or whether it served some other purpose entirely." Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Gwen Archer, who appeared at the cellar entrance with obvious reluctance. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, and her manner suggested someone struggling with difficult decisions. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "I wondered if I might have a word. There are things I should perhaps have mentioned earlier." Miss Marple welcomed the young woman with characteristic warmth, sensing that the moment for full confession had finally arrived. She extinguished the candle and moved to a position where she could observe Gwen's face clearly in the dim light. "I've been thinking about what you asked regarding the tools and the twine," Gwen began, her voice barely audible in the echoing chamber, "about Mr. Clay's involvement and the timing of everything. And what conclusions have you reached, my dear? I fear I may have been used without fully understanding what was happening. The relabeling work, the adjustments to the inventory records, even the arrangement of the barrels. I thought it was all to help Mrs. Vaughan present the best possible case to Mr. Sykes. But you now suspect otherwise?" Gwen nodded miserably. Mr. Clay seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and when. He had very specific instructions about which barrels should be positioned where and which ones should be marked for immediate inspection. Miss Marple listened with growing interest as Gwen described Clay's detailed involvement in preparing the cellar for Sykes's visit. The picture that emerged was of systematic manipulation designed not to facilitate an honest assessment, but rather to ensure that Sykes would discover specific discrepancies at precisely the right moment. "He told me the barrel should be marked empty to draw Mr. Sykes's attention," Gwen continued. "Said it would be better if the irregularities were discovered naturally rather than having to be explained offensively. And did it occur to you to question why Mr. Clay was so concerned with the details of Mr. Sykes's inspection? I assumed he was simply trying to help Mrs. Vaughan avoid embarrassment. He said the property would be much easier to sell if there weren't any outstanding questions about the wine inventory." The implications of this revelation were not lost on Miss Marple. Clay's eagerness to facilitate the discovery of wine fraud suggested motives that extended beyond mere neighborly assistance. If Beatrice could be discredited as dishonest, her position in any property negotiations would be severely compromised. "Miss Archer," she said gently, "I wonder if you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Clay's knots when he secured items with the twine. Some people have distinctive ways of tying things." Gwen looked puzzled by the question, but answered readily, "Oh yes, he always uses that sailor's knot. What do you call it? A bowline, I think. Says it's the only knot worth knowing because it never slips, but always comes undone when you need it to." Miss Marple made a careful note of this detail, adding it to the growing body of evidence that painted Clay as someone with both the knowledge and opportunity to orchestrate the entire affair. The specialized knotwork, combined with his detailed involvement in preparing the scene, suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond opportunistic fraud. As evening shadows began to gather in the cellar, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception that had been unraveled. The question now was not whether Clay had engineered Sykes's near-fatal accident, but rather how to prove it conclusively enough to satisfy Inspector Slack's demands for evidence. Chapter 9. The Valuer's Map. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the vineyard with a grudging air of a man who had been compelled to reconsider his initial conclusions. Miss Marple met him in Beatrice's parlor, where the accumulated evidence of her investigation lay spread across the mahogany table, like the pieces of an intricate puzzle finally approaching completion. "Very well, Miss Marple," Slack said, settling his considerable bulk into one of the worn armchairs. "I'll grant that your observations raise certain questions about the accident. But questions aren't proof, and Maurice Clay is a respected member of this community." "Indeed he is," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. which is why I thought it might be instructive to examine his professional records. With his permission, of course, she had, it transpired, already obtained that permission through the simple expedient of calling upon Clay at his office in Much Benham Village, ostensibly to discuss the tragic events at the vineyard. Her visit had been brief but productive, yielding insights that cast his recent activities in an entirely new light. His filing system is remarkably comprehensive, she explained to Slack, producing a manila folder that Clay had willingly allowed her to examine, including detailed surveys and valuations of properties throughout the district. The folder contained a complete cadastral map of the Whodunit vineyard, annotated with Clay's professional assessment of its development potential. More significantly, it included correspondence with building contractors and local planning officials that predated Jules Vallon's death by several months. Most interesting, Slack admitted, studying the documents with growing attention. These letters suggest Clay had been planning residential development of the vineyard site long before any question of its sale had arisen. And observe the timing of his most recent correspondence, Miss Marple added, indicating a letter dated just 3 days before Sykes's visit. He appears to have been quite confident that the property would become available for purchase in the immediate future. The implications were clear to both of them. Clay's certainty about acquiring the vineyard suggested foreknowledge that went beyond mere speculation about Beatrice's financial difficulties. He had been positioning himself to benefit from circumstances that he may well have helped to create. In Clay's wastepaper basket, Miss Marple had discovered additional evidence that proved even more damning. Among the discarded papers was a scrap bearing calculations in Clay's distinctive handwriting. HH. Water, microfart, sufficient weight, followed by what appeared to be measurements for the cellar's dimensions. The abbreviation HH stands for hogshead, I believe, she explained to Slack's increasingly interested tension, and the reference to water weight suggests he had calculated precisely how much liquid would be needed to achieve the desired destructive force. Dr. Haydock arrived as they were examining this evidence, bringing with him news from the hospital that added yet another dimension to their understanding of the case. Sykes is recovering well, he reported, and his memory of the incident has become considerably clearer. He now recalls hearing what he describes as a snapping sound just before the barrels began to move like a rope or cord breaking under tension, which would be consistent with our theory about the green twine being used to trigger the collapse, Miss Marple observed. A carefully positioned line pulled taut at precisely the right moment. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Beatrice, who brought with her a discovery that cast an entirely different light on recent events. She appeared agitated and carried a wooden box that Miss Marple recognized as coming from the vineyard storage areas. I found something most disturbing, Beatrice announced, setting the box on the table with trembling hands. Hidden in the old potting shed where Jules kept his grafting supplies, the box contained an assortment of bottles filled with what appeared to be homemade wine of decidedly amateur quality. The labels, written in Beatrice's careful script, indicated various fruit wines made from elder, black currants, and other garden produce. I'm afraid, Beatrice said with obvious embarrassment, that I've been supplementing our dwindling wine stocks with these domestic productions. It seemed preferable to admitting complete failure of the vineyard enterprise. Miss Marple examined the bottles with interest, noting their humble origins and the careful attention that had been paid to their preparation. While hardly comparable to Jules's ambitious vintages, they represented honest, if modest, efforts to maintain some semblance of wine production. You prepared these yourself, Mrs. Vallon? Yes, though I feared they would hardly satisfy a professional assessment. They were intended only to fill out the inventory until we could properly restock with legitimate wine. Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of Clay's correspondence with evident confusion. But this makes Clay's case stronger, not weaker, if Mrs. Vaughan was already engaging in fraudulent representation of her stock. On the contrary, Miss Marple said gently, this discovery actually supports Mrs. Vaughan's innocence in the more serious matter. These bottles represent honest, if misguided, efforts to maintain her husband's legacy. They bear no resemblance to the systematic deception we discovered in the cellar. She moved to the window where she could observe Clay's distant figure still engaged in his surveying activities. His movements remained confident and unhurried, suggesting either innocence or remarkable self-control in the face of mounting evidence. The crucial distinction, she continued, lies in the nature and purpose of the deceptions involved. Mrs. Vaughan's fruit wines, however inappropriate, were never intended to cause physical harm to anyone. The water-filled barrels in the cellar, however, were specifically prepared as weapons. But how can you prove Clay was responsible for that particular substitution? Slack demanded. Anyone with access to the cellar could have made those modifications. True, Miss Marple agreed. But not everyone would have possessed the specialized knowledge required to execute the scheme so effectively. The water delivery system, the precise calculation of weights, the understanding of barrel stability, all these elements suggest someone with considerable technical expertise. She produced from her bag a small, leather palm guard of the type worn by workmen engaged in heavy rope work. The leather showed recent use and bore traces of the green twine fibers they had found in the cellar wall. I found this among Mr. Clay's effects during my visit to his office, she explained. He explained that he uses it when handling heavy loads to protect his hands from rope burns. Dr. Haydock examined the palm guard with professional interest. The wear patterns are consistent with recent use involving considerable tension, and these fiber traces match the twine samples perfectly. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued, the guard shows indentations that correspond exactly to the diameter of the green twine. Someone wearing this protection could have manipulated the trigger mechanism without leaving telltale marks on their palms. The accumulation of evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Miss Marple sensed that one crucial element remained to complete the picture of Clay's guilt. Somewhere in the complex web of preparation and execution lay the final proof that would satisfy even Inspector Slack's demands for certainty. Chapter 10. Even Song, The Hand. Behind the Cask. The autumn evening had settled over Much Benham with the particular golden quality that speaks of seasons turning and secrets finally ready to be revealed. In Beatrice Vaughan's parlor, the principal actors in the drama had gathered at Miss Marple's gentle but insistent invitation. Inspector Slack with his notebook at the ready, Dr. Haydock lending his professional authority, and Maurice Clay himself, summoned by a message suggesting his expertise was needed to clarify certain technical matters. Clay entered with his customary confidence, though Miss Marple's keen eyes detected a slight weariness in his manner as he took in the assembled company and the array of evidence spread across the mahogany table. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began, settling herself in her chair with her knitting bag at her side, I believe we have finally assembled enough pieces of this particular puzzle to see the complete picture. She gestured toward the various items of evidence, the reversed wedge with its coating of fresh tallow, the green twine fibers, the leather palm guard, and Clay's own documentation of his development plans. The question before us is not whether Mr. Sykes's injury was the result of an accident, but rather how such an elaborate attempt at murder was conceived and executed. Clay's composure remained intact, though his hands moved restlessly in his lap. Murder is a serious accusation, Miss Marple. I trust you have compelling evidence to support such a claim. Indeed, I do. Let me explain how the crime was accomplished. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window where the vineyard's terrace slopes were visible in the fading light. Her voice took on the measured cadence of someone who had spent considerable time organizing complex thoughts into clear narrative. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. One of the hogsheads was deliberately filled with water rather than wine, making it substantially heavier than its companions. This was accomplished using the elaborate piping system we discovered in the upper cellar, a system that required considerable technical knowledge to install. She turned back to face the room, her mild blue eyes holding Clay's gaze steadily. The supporting wedge beneath this barrel was then deliberately reversed and lubricated with fresh tallow to facilitate easy removal. A small groove was carved in the wedge's edge to accommodate a grape hook, and green twine was threaded through the crack in the cellar wall to create a trigger mechanism. Dr. Haydock nodded with professional appreciation for the methodology. The chalk line on the floor would have ensured the barrel followed a predetermined path toward its intended victim. Precisely. When Mr. Sykes positioned himself to examine the barrel marked empty, a marking specifically designed to attract his attention, the perpetrator needed only to pull the twine from his concealed position. The wedge would slip free, and the water-heavy barrel would roll with devastating force along the prepared trajectory. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with growing interest. But how can you prove Clay was the one who operated this mechanism? Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up the leather palm guard. Several pieces of evidence point conclusively to Mr. Clay's involvement. First, this protective gear, which bears fiber, traces matching our green twine and shows where patterns consistent with operating under considerable tension. She indicated the reversed wedge with its distinctive markings. Second, the specialized knowledge required to install the water delivery system and calculate the precise weight needed for maximum destructive force. Mr. Clay's own notes, found in his wastebasket, include these very calculations. Clay shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent, his expression carefully neutral. Third, the timing of his activities. He borrowed the grape hook and twine on the very morning of Mr. Sykes's arrival, returning them immediately after the accident. He also demonstrated detailed knowledge of wine, adulteration techniques far beyond what one would expect from a property assessor. Miss Marple paused to allow the weight of this evidence to settle before continuing. But perhaps most revealing is the distinctive nautical knot found securing the trigger mechanism, a bowline, which Miss Archer confirms is Mr. Clay's preferred method of tying anything that must hold securely but release cleanly when needed. She moved to the table and picked up Clay's correspondence with the building contractors. The motive becomes clear when we examine Mr. Clay's advanced planning for residential development of this property. He had invested considerable time and resources in preparing for its acquisition, including obtaining planning permissions and contractor estimates. Mr. Sykes's thorough assessment would have revealed not only the wine fraud perpetrated by Mrs. Vaughan in her desperation, but also the more systematic deception involving the water-filled barrels. This discovery would have discredited Mrs. Vaughan entirely, forcing her into a distress sale that would benefit Mr. Clay's development plans. Clay's facade finally began to crack under the relentless accumulation of evidence. His hands clenched into fists, and his voice carried a defensive edge when he finally spoke. Even if your theories were correct, which I don't admit, you cannot prove I intended serious harm. Perhaps I merely meant to demonstrate the instability of the storage arrangements. I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. The water system was installed to create maximum weight. The chalk line was drawn to ensure the barrel would strike precisely where Mr. Sykes would be standing, and the entire mechanism was designed to activate when he reached the most vulnerable position. She folded her hands over her knitting with an air of quiet satisfaction. These preparations took weeks to complete and required intimate knowledge of Mr. Sykes's planned inspection procedures. This was not a moment of impulse, but a carefully orchestrated attempt at murder. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with official gravity. Maurice Clay, I am arresting you on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy to defraud. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." As the handcuffs closed around Clay's wrists, his composure finally collapsed entirely. "It was never meant to kill him," he protested. "Just to injure him enough to prevent the inspection from proceeding. The property development would have benefited everyone, created jobs, brought prosperity to the district." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple quietly, "but the decision of what would benefit Mrs. Vaughan was surely hers to make, not yours to impose through violence." Later, after Clay had been taken away and the official procedures completed, Miss Marple sat with Lady Bantry in the peaceful evening air, their chairs positioned to catch the last rays of autumn sunlight. "Such a small thing," Lady Bantry observed, touching the smooth wood of the recovered wedge. "A piece of carved oak. To think it might have determined a man's fate." Miss Marple adjusted her knitting with practiced movements. "Wedges and knots and chalk marks, my dear Dolly. Wine ages in silence, but crime usually leaves its own small orderly trail for those who know how to read the signs." In the distance, the vineyard slopes caught the golden light of evening,